Over a lifetime in Canadian letters, Barry Callaghan has worn every hat in the business: writing, publishing, teaching, works in fiction, poetry, and journalism. In his short fiction, he's also inhabited characters of every stripe and type. All the Lonely People now gathers work from across his career in one hefty volume. And it brings Barry Callaghan to our studio tonight. Hi, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
A few months ago, you were actually on the show talking to Steve Paikin. Before we start our interview, I'd like to show you a clip of the video.
I was in Montreal in '67 with an English poet, George Barker, and we were being addressed by a man that none of us knew. And Barker said to me, "Oh, who's that guy? Does he write good poetry?" And I said, "No, that's a guy named Pierre Trudeau. He's the Minister of Justice. He may become Prime Minister." And he said, "I can't believe it. He speaks so coherently. Each clause is right." It was rational. And that was what I admired in him, the use of the language. And the language will tell you everything.
Just to jump off that last sentence, language will tell you everything.
Yes.
How do you use language to create your characters?
The problem with telling stories at the beginning is what they used to call point of view or voice. I'll give you an example of the problem that creates. There's a story of mine called The Cohen and Cowan, which is a story set in a very Jewish sensibility. So I had been commissioned to write that story by a deadline. So I started writing it, and I wrote the first page from the all-seeing, you might say, Tolstoyan eye, the author who knows everything about everybody and what's going on in everybody's head. And the first page, I looked at it and I thought, it's competent, because I have a hard time writing an incompetent page, but it was dead. So I threw it away. 2 days later, I tried it again, dead. 3 days later, I tried it again, dead. Then I was going out the door on my way to supper. I was living in Paris. As I stepped out the door, and without premeditation, without looking for it, I heard a voice in my head. And the voice was, "My name is Cowan. And in case you don't know, Cowan is cut down from Cohen," which means, and I was in the voice of this guy. I turned around and I wrote the story in 35 minutes, right? Because I had the voice, which gave me the language. If you want to know what the rhythm of the language was, if you think of the comedian Jackie Mason, if you remember Jackie Mason,
yes.
It had that rhythm out of Yiddish, you know. So he would say, I want to tell you what you're going to do. This is what you're going to do. You're going to go down in the corner, and this is what you're going to say, you see. So you hear the language, and the language, if you're hearing it right, gives you the authenticity. It also gives you the motor to keep the story going, so that when I was inside this guy's head, it's actually a story about a Jewish man at Christmas time, or a Jewish couple at Christmas time. What do they do about a Christmas tree? It's all done in that voice. So I have, over the years, developed what you might call my own tone and my own images and my own preoccupations that appear in the Tolstoyan voice. So if I'm just describing something, I will pick out images to make them work as description. They're just inherent in my sensibility, my temperament. But in the dialogue, or in the monologue, it becomes a question of who the character is. Now, in my case, there are a lot of different voices in my stories. How does that happen? How do I hear these voices? And if they have authenticity, and I think they do, I hope you do, where does the authenticity come from? How do I get the rhythm right? Well, there's a weird thing in my sensibility that I discovered actually when I used to appear on radio in the 70s. I have a trick that I can't control in my head. Apparently there's some name for it in Hollywood for people like me. If I spend a lot of time with someone I like, I can't stop it. I end up mimicking them. to give you an embarrassing example, I was very close to an Irish poet named John Montague who had a stutter. So he would say, he had a little poem about a woman who can't stop giving birth to children every spring. And a couple of lines in that poem, she explains, you can't help it. Now I'm going to do it the way Montague would read it, you see. You can't help it. You just, in the spring, yeah, it comes over to you. You have to lie down.
One thing that I thought was really interesting about the characters is that they often seem to live on the margins of society.
Right.
Why do these characters fascinate you?
I don't know. It's a matter of temperament. I'll tell you a little story that's in my other book that explains how I discovered that I have a certain temperament. When I was a 9-year-old boy, I found myself selling newspapers on a street corner.
I used to do that too.
Yeah. And this was during the war. Mostly women were working. They would get off the streetcar and come to my position at the corner of Spadina and DuPont. And one day, a woman, maybe in her 20s, middle 20s, came to me and she said, I'd like to make a business deal with you. I'd never made a business deal. I'm 9 years old. What's a business deal? Papers were 3 cents then. I sold a Telegram and a Star. She said, I'm looking for work. All I want to read in the newspaper is the help wanted column. I will give you 2 cents for the paper. I'll take it around the corner. I'll read just that page. I won't disturb anything. I'll write down anything I need. I'll fold it perfectly, give it back to you, and you can resell the newspaper. You'll make extra money doing that if you'll do that deal with me. I said, okay. But I realized that I was saying okay, not because I wanted to make the money. I had no interest in money, frankly, and still don't. I tend to spend too much money. Something in her touched me that I immediately felt engaged in what her situation was. And this became a real problem. She did this for about 4 days, and then she never came back. And I assumed she must have got a job. And I had a problem. I told my father and mother I didn't want to sell newspapers anymore. I wanted to play baseball. They said, all right, you don't care about money. And I wondered, should I tell them this story? Because in a way I cheated people. You know, I knew that I was reselling a newspaper as if it were new. But I was doing that because of this woman who was in dire straits. And all my instincts led me to sympathize with her, but I didn't know then, I didn't believe then that I could explain that to my parents. And I didn't know whether they would approve or disapprove, so I just kept it to myself. And there is something in people that I am attracted to when I'm confronted by their vulnerabilities, their loneliness. Now, I have to say, being the age I am, and I just mentioned that story, the war, I grew up in the wartime as a child. When I published my first book, The Black Queen Stories, they were all written individually as stories, not as an intended book. About a year after the book came out, I decided, well, I think I should sit down and read my book, see what I think about it. So I did. And I was startled.
Why?
There's so much loneliness in it and a sympathy for lonely women. I was surprised.
Well, we're told that love is the
Now,
emotion.
I know where that came from.
Where?
I thought about it for 20 seconds. I said, well, it makes perfect sense. I grew up on a street in which there were almost no men. They were all at war. So it was part of my natural upbringing. When I would be a child out playing baseball on the street, I knew that Mrs. So-and-so sitting on her front porch secretly drank gin all day.
Well, we're told that love is the emotion that binds us. Is it loneliness that is the emotion that binds us?
Yeah, of course, we all suffer from a kind of dreadful loneliness, and we find ways to dance around it and to fill the lonely moments. And the The particular pressures of particular moments of loneliness change, but it's always there. So.
In the preface to All the Lonely People, Margaret Atwood has this to say about your work. She writes, how to convey the flavor of Barry Callaghan's prose. You might divide prose styles into the plain song, such as Hemingway's In Our Time, or the Baroque, such as Faulkner or Proust or Thomas Wolfe. For plain song writers, less is more. For Baroque writers, more is more. And the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Callaghan inclines toward the Baroque. If he were a parade, it would be a Mardi Gras parade. If he were a church, it would be a Mexican cathedral, and the more candles and paper flowers and gold ornaments, the better. Would you agree with this assessment of your writing style?
To a point. I think that what's contained in that description is also a response to, in a way, a response to how I've tried to live my life.
Which is how?
Well, all such descriptions end up sounding pretentious. I think it would be fair, and people would agree that I have run, and when my beloved Claire was alive, we ran a house that was pretty open. People were there. It was, I wouldn't call it a salon, but always there were people there, and we were known for our parties, and I still hold our New Year's party. With the note that I think that Claire should quit pretending that she's not here. Now, I will make a little confession about these, that kind of life, which I regard as a kind of celebration. Mm. I was brought up and raised in a very narrow town, a Presbyterian town, dominated by Ulster Presbyterians and a police force that was generally Ulster or Scottish cops. Mm-hmm. I didn't exactly feel home in this territory, let's put it that way.
Really?
And I still think that there is a kind of Presbyterian yellow streak that runs right down the back of Toronto, and it'll never go away. There's always a kind of denial. And there are little things that indicate this for me around the city. For example, it's wonderful now that in our restaurants, people eat out on the street. When I grew up, this was verboten. You couldn't eat on the street. The heavens above, you couldn't do anything on the street. But there's a little trick to Toronto eating. Go to Rome and go to a cafe where the people are eating out on the street. The tables spill out on the street, the chairs spill out onto the street. Not in Toronto. Mm-hmm. There's a fence around all of those cafe outdoor areas. We're going to have pleasure, fence it in, right? There's always this limit in this town when it comes to the celebration of things. Don't go too far.
So are you saying that Toronto...
You hear that dreadful word that exists only, in my experience, in Canada. Don't be arrogant. If you go to New York with arrogance and say, I am here to take New York by storm, a dozen New Yorkers will step up, oh yeah, and they'll say, I want 10% of that. If you arrive in Toronto and say, I want to take Toronto by storm, I've got talent, someone will say, don't, arrogant. Want to limit it, you see. I can say this, well, never mind. You get the point. You know, there's a story in the book about the destruction of our home in Chinatown.
Yes, I was just going to ask you about that.
When I rebuilt the house, after it was terribly, $250,000 damaged by vandals, druggies, and I got it all back in shape, and we had a big celebratory party to open it up. A man I know, and a man I loved, actually, he'd been very good and kind to me in the world of journalism all my life. I treasured him. He took me aside, and he said, well, I hope you've learned your lesson. I said, what lesson? And he said, learn how to lock your doors. Mm-hmm. Learn how to close your doors. You're too open. You're too open with everything. Mm-hmm. You got invaded. I said, are you telling me I deserved to be invaded because I want to live openly? Claire and I want to live openly like this? He said, it's just the nature of people. They'll invade you every time. Lock your doors. I know.
Well, since you brought it up,
do?
would you mind reading a passage from your book when you do write about that, and the reaction that you share with one person?
Oh, yes, I remember this moment.
And the story is called Because Why is a Crooked Letter.
Because Why is a Crooked Letter? Now, I got that title from Claire. When Claire used to ask her mother a question, she'd say, why? 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 And her mother's answer was, because why is a crooked letter? Right. Don't you feel violated? A newswoman friend who'd come in from the lane asked. Don't you feel raped? No, I said. You don't? No, and you're a woman. You should know better. This is a house. No one's entered my body. No one has penetrated me. This isn't a rape. Yes, but she took off her glasses and then put them back on. She was offended as if I had been difficult when all she had intended was sympathy. But I was being difficult because I believe, especially in times when there are charred shadows on the walls, that exactness is one of the few ways I can make a stand in the ditch against sentimentality, self-pity, falseness.
Well, could you talk, thank you for doing that. That's a real pleasure for us. Could you talk a bit about that lack of sentimentality in contrast to the passage later in the story, as the criminals are about to be sentenced, where you write that the protagonist and his wife are, quote, doing time, end quote, time calculated in lost writing and sculpting?
Look, if you're going to see the world, and in a way, any writer worth his or her oats is a kind of witness. You can be a witness just to your hometown and make big things out of that, like Emily Dickinson did. Or you can go out into the world and be a witness to savage things and shocking things. The trick is that you have to preserve the unsentimental seeing eye. Now, in something I wrote elsewhere, I described my relationship with my father, who was also a writer.
The great Morley Camp, yeah.
I hope you know.
Yeah. Well, he's a Canadian icon, as you are.
So what happens between two writers when they start writing about each other? Like start stealing from each other's lives. For example, one terrible moment with Morley, I had to go to the hospital with him because he had blood underneath the skin all over here. We thought, oh my God, it's cancer. It's exploded now, right? And I found myself in a waiting room, standing with my father, who was completely naked. He was then about 75. Well, there are admonitions in the Bible against looking upon your father naked. You know, you're warned. There's good reasons for warnings in the Bible, you know. It changes the nature of your relationship if you look upon your naked parent. Just what the change will be depends on the people, but it's changed. There I was staring at my naked father. His narrow, thin legs, the yellow toenails of age. A striking, startling moment in my life when I think maybe this vulnerable man in front of me I'm now about to lose. Okay. What did I do with that? Well, I looked at it actually quite unsentimentally. And in my next novel, there it was. That scene, without changing anything. I didn't have his name, but there was a character looking at his naked father, and I just wrote it down exactly as I saw it. Unsentimental, you would say. Of course it was unsentimental. I was looking at what I was looking at, you know?
But if you're saying that you saw him being vulnerable, isn't that an emotion? Isn't that being sentimental?
No, that's an observation. Now, the real trick to that story is what did he think? And he didn't say a word. He looked at that on the page, and he knew it was him, but he didn't say anything to me about it. He didn't say, what are you doing reporting that way? Or why did you write about me? Why did you expose me? Why did you this? He didn't say anything. He just, right. Because he talked to me about the book. He was looking at the book as a book. He was looking at it as a piece of writing.
He was being unsentimental.
Unsentimental. And that's got nothing to do with sympathy, right? And the kind of sympathy that I told you about when I sold a newspaper to that woman. You have sympathy for what people are going through. I was obviously sympathetic to my father, but I watched it. Now, I'm not the first person to say you do this. Hemingway said this. If you're watching something like, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, if you're watching your grandmother die, you have to write it down like you see your grandmother dying. That's a fact, that's true. Which does not mean, if you're a writer of any character and quality, that emotion won't get into the prose, into the description. But the emotion is not clouding the way you see it. It doesn't act as a filter. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Right.
In a long-winded way. Sorry.
No. That's a.
You get rid of the filter. You see. So I'll tell you how this works in journalism. Because I've had a lot of success interviewing people who were on the edge of things, right? Whether they were, frankly, terrorists, I've done that, or gangsters, I've done that, or to turn it right around, prime ministers I didn't like.
You've also written about characters who are black, who are priests, who are gay or lesbian and transvestite, or who are Ojibwa.
You have to come to all of my point about those interviews. Yeah. You have to come to all of it without betraying some kind of premeditated judgment.
But how do you inhabit those characters in order to bring them to life on the page?
Something about their situation touches me, like that woman, and then I hear, in a sense, the way they feel, the way they are. And what can set it off is simply an image, if you want. So, for example, I have a story about a black woman. It's called Crow Jane's Blues, and I have not hesitated to write about the lives of women. I wrote a whole novel in the voice of a woman. That story started, I had no idea where I was going with that story, except I started with an image that I remembered of a woman I knew who'd been an old blues singer, an ex-blues singer. She wasn't that old. She was about 39, 40, but she wasn't in the business anymore. And I had walked with her for about half a block on Spadina Avenue late at night, and I picked up, let's say, the scent of deep loneliness and a kind of regret. And she went into the old show bar that was in the Waverly to hear a woman sing. And I stayed with her for about 5 minutes with her, but also watching her respond to the way this girl was singing. That's all I had. But something in that feeling that I picked out of her, in that area, that territory, was all I needed to just slip right into her sensibility and tell her story.
Well, there can be quite strong criticism of an author who, in their fiction, is seen to take from a culture that they don't belong. You've said that you've written about women, and I've also listed some of the people, like you've written about a character who's black, a priest, people who are gay. Is that a valid critique in your opinion?
No, it's pointless. I could bother to discuss it, but I'm not going to waste our time. The whole argument over appropriation of voice is just a movement toward narrowness. I'm for openness. If you get the voice wrong, that's a literary question, right? But for example, I wrote a story. There's a story in the book there, quite a long story, called Dry Alta Cockers. It's about 3 older Jewish men, 2 of whom survived the Holocaust. Now, you can say it could take a lot of guts to write a long story about 2 guys, assuming you could be inside their head as Holocaust survivors, and particularly as they have a certain gangsterish element about them. It's not sentimental, not a sentimental view of these guys as survivors. They are really tough guys, right? something possessed me to write that story, and I did. I could never write it again, because, what can I say? When this book was launched, a young woman who is a writer and an artist introduced the launching, and she raised this subject. She said, there are some people who are simply glib, who will say that Barry has committed a sin. He has appropriated these voices, appropriated the experiences of other people, and he has no right to do it. I'm here to tell you that Barry didn't appropriate the voices appropriated him. Now, I happen to think that happens.
So you write what comes to you.
I wrote a whole novel in the voice of a woman, right? And to say genuinely to you that I just felt possessed by this woman. I wrote the novel very quickly. I just kept talking to myself in the voice of this woman for about 3 weeks. I wrote it in 3 weeks. And then when it went away, it went away. I can't do it again. I've thought about it. I really liked her voice. I liked being there. I sat down one day and thought, gee, I should write a sequel to her story.
Well, speaking of sequels.
I can't do it.
Speaking of sequels, because we have so much to talk to you about. We've run out of time, but you're actually going to be back, and we're going to continue our conversation in another episode of The Agenda.
Thank you. You're a generous-hearted woman.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.